Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us at today's session, Circular Economy 2, Mapping Out the Resource Recovery and Recycling Opportunities Across Industry Markets. My name is Anna Maria Faust, and I head up the conference production team at Reed Exhibitions. I begin by acknowledging the Gadigal and Baragal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I work, and whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land for over 60,000 years since the Dreamtime. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. It's been a very challenging year for everyone. I'm sure we find ourselves, like many others, having to adapt to ensure we're able to continue to operate as business as usual. To us, this meant canceling our physical events in 2020 and pivoting to a digital offering. And we've been delighted with the response from the industry so far and are grateful to all our speakers and sponsors. A reminder that all presentations and webinar sessions will be available online at the end of the week by visiting www.wasteexpoaustralia.com.au. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our chair for today's session, Corinne Taylor, the Principal Consultant for MRA Consulting. Corinne is a skilled environmental consultant with expertise on the fundamentals of circular economy. She is also experienced in waste management and resource recovery, business sustainability plans, life cycle thinking and analysis, and corporate social responsibility. During her career, she's worked with a broad range of organizations to deliver practical, achievable change. Thank you, Corinne.
Thanks, Anna Maria, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Waste Expo Australia's second session on the circular economy. Before we begin today's conversation, I would just like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from Gadigal Wangal country, the traditional lands of the Gadigal Wangal people, and who continue to care for country for over 65,000 years. And that those of us in the circular economy space who are focused on designing out waste and pollution, keeping materials in use, and regenerating natural systems are contributing to caring for country. In this afternoon's session, Resource Recovery and Recycling Opportunities Across Industry Markets, we are focusing on the practicalities of a circular economy. We heard about policy and frameworks this morning, and now it is time to get down to business. And as I was preparing for this session and broadly thinking about circular economy in general, I came across a quote that I think articulates what many of us who've been in this resource recovery for so many years have been thinking as the term circular economy has gained traction. And I'm just going to read it to you because I think it nails a couple of things. It's the circular economy approach is not a new fad, but a maturing body of knowledge and practice that has evolved since the 1980s. It is an idea whose time has come. The importance of creating efficient, renewable energy and materials-based economies and production systems is increasingly self-evident as humanity is catching up with the biophysical reality of fossil resource and energy constraints on a planet heading for 9 billion human inhabitants by 2050, while facing the real and present danger of runaway climate change. So we in the industry know that the tenets of circular economy to design out waste and pollution, to keep products and materials in use for as long as possible, and to regenerate natural systems just makes sense. And we've been quietly, and not so quietly, trying to do this for decades. I'm minded of the case study I was taught in my graduate degree of Fuji Xerox's Camellia plant here in Sydney, undertaking industry-leading remanufacturing of their copiers so that they could take serviceable parts and put them into new copiers, which became the international standard for the company in the early 1990s. We have a strong and proud history of reuse through our charity shops and garage sales, and the degree of community interest in putting the right thing into the right bin demonstrates that the Australian public wants its resources to be well stewarded. What we have been missing is the political will, the systemic shifts and the economic settings to ensure it can happen smoothly. And what circular economy seems to promise is that finally those things are coming together and we're all engaging and heading in the same direction. So today our three speakers will share their experiences with working to create circular markets and practices in Australia. And you'll note I said three speakers. We sadly have an apology. Rose Reid from the National Waste and Recycling Industry Council is not able to join us today due to personal reasons. She will share a brief presentation with the conference organisers at a later date for attendees to view, and she sends her apologies. So our format is as follows. Barry, Blake and Mark will share their insights, and then we will open the floor to questions, which I will have the honour to read out on your behalf. If you have questions as the session progresses, please add them to the Q&A panel that you can find at the bottom of your screen. If you like a question, please upvote it so we can ensure the most valuable questions are asked of our participants. So now I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker, Barry Cozier, who is the Director, Sustainability at the Australian Food and Grocery Council. He has over 30 years experience in the resource recovery industry and the food and grocery industry, and like many, including myself, he started his working career packing shelves at grocery companies. He has been involved with, you can read his bio, but an extensive list of industry panels. And so I think that he brings that experience plus the resource recovery into this space, and we can all learn from him. Today, Barry's going to talk about creating a packaging circular economy.
Thanks, Corinne. I'll just share my screen and move along with it. So, yeah, thanks everyone for your time this morning. As Corinne said, I've worked in the last 30 years in food and grocery sector and some time in the waste sector. So very keen to see a packaging circular economy develop, and personally think it's highly likely it can happen. Corinne quoted some knowledgeable people in circular economy today. I'm going to quote people like Stephen J. Covey, and if you listen out, and this dates me, I'll be quoting David Byrne from Talking Heads. So keep an eye out for that. Going back to the start, most people will have seen this Ellen MacArthur Foundation chart showing the circular economy, the diagram, and if you look at the source of Wikipedia, they're saying this really gained momentum in the late 1970s. I guess I'm challenging that a little bit. If you think back to 1922, none of us would have been around, but nearly 100 years ago, one of our key brands in our sector, Vegemite, was created when Fred Walker, the Fred Walker Company, hired a young chemist to develop a spread from brewer's yeast. So it's a really classic example of taking the byproducts of one manufacturing process and making it circular and putting it into another product that I guess we Aussies call one of our classic products, not shared worldwide, but something we all enjoy. So I think that's just a good example of where circularity is working and working well. And really today, I just want to talk through the gaps and why that's not happening in packaging and what can be done to move forward. So the chart the diagram you can see in front of you, I've tried to summarize down. APCO released a report late last year that was essentially a material flow analysis of packaging through the supply chain. And so I've summarized a 120-page report down to about 3 slides. So I'll just talk through these. As you can see there's about 5.5 million tons of packaging put on the market. 88% of that, or 4.7 million, is recyclable. So what you're actually seeing is there's 800,000 tons of design losses. So they're losses in the supply chain that between the packaging companies and brand owners, we need to design those out. So that's very clear, and that's in the national packaging targets. When you move through around the circular economy, you get the collection losses, and this is where the biggest loss is. Out of the packaging that is technically recyclable, only there's 1.3 million tons that are not recycled. So I want to talk through what some of the causes are and what some of the solutions are. And when you then move further around through collection and sorting through MRFs, another 700,000 tons is lost. And then there's a further 800,000 tons that's recovered that doesn't end up in a recycled content. So the question for me is why? Having worked in both the waste sector and in MRFs, and for packaging companies designing it, how do we move forward and create a circular economy? So if I look at the 3 major packaging types that are used in Australia, if you look at paper and cardboard, really got to give this a gold star. There's close on 3 million tons put on the market annually. 92% of that is recyclable. There's a loss here, 71% is collected, with 63% being recycled, meaning that 51% or 49%, I should say, of all new packaging of cardboard and paper is recycled content. So there's a gold star circularity happening, and clean streams can improve that further. When you go to glass, very similar, give this a silver star. Just over 1.2 million tons put on the market. 100% of that is recyclable, but here we have losses of collection. There's 25% not getting into recycling bins, and then and no one's going to be surprised here, due to mainly the quality issues of glass through commingled, it's down to 46% recycled, meaning only 32% gets back into recycled content. So hence AFGC and our members are very supportive of initiatives like container deposit schemes, which will clean up the glass and help generate a clean stream of glass material, and also Victorian government introducing glass recycling bins. But that's really where the good news ends. When you end up looking at plastics, this is where there's a lot of work required. So there's just over 1 million tonnes put on the market. 59% of that is recyclable, 13% has poor recyclability, meaning there's another 20 to 30% that's not recyclable that industry needs to correct. However, another big loss is only 20% is being collected. So whilst 60 to 70% is recyclable, only 20% is collected, 16% is recycled, which is why it's difficult to put recycled content back into plastic. There's only 16% available, and the bulk of that's in PET. So the real question here is why? And this is where I'll quote David Byrne from Talking Heads and age myself. You may well ask yourself, how did I get here? Where does that recycling go to? How do I work this? Am I right? Am I wrong? And then the bit we're trying to avoid, and we're working with government on, is to avoid MRF operators, collectors, packaging companies, brand owners in 5 years saying, my God, what have I done? Because I've moved in the wrong direction. So I'll spend the next probably 5 minutes just going through some solutions. But I think it's important to call out right up front what I have seen a lot of, and I've called it the circular economy, or the plastic packaging circularity blame game. And that's where a lot of people sit in a room who are well-intentioned and tell someone else what they should do, rather than everyone getting on the same page and working out a solution and all working together on it at the same time in the same direction to achieve it at the same time. So, so that's what the next few slides aim to do, and happy to have any questions on these, or any calls or emails on them later on. This is just the AFGC's proposed plastic packaging roadmap, and happy to have any input into it. So if you look at plastic, as I mentioned, 1 million tonnes put onto the market annually by packaging companies and brand owners. 300,000 tonnes of that is not recyclable. So they're the design losses. So I'll talk through how we think we can resolve those. The biggest loss in the plastic circular economy is the collection losses. So this is out of the 72% of packaging that could be recycled, how much is not even collected? So it's going straight to landfill or entering the environment. So how do we fix that? And then also, how do we get it back into recycled content, which is currently below around 2%. And there's a target on that to hit 20% by 2025, and the recovery rate's got to go from 16 to 70% by 2025. Now, as brand owners, our members, we can help this, but we can't drive it entirely. So I guess we all want to work together in a harmonious direction. So I'll just talk through this, and these are our recommendations on what can and could happen to help drive this forward. So this loss of 300,000 tonnes, brand owners are currently using the prep tools supplied by APCO to redesign packaging. So to design out unrecyclable packaging, change sizes, change shapes, change laminates to make more packaging recyclable. APCO is also releasing some problematic packaging guidelines. So that's the 12% of packaging that's not recyclable. What should companies switch to, telling them why it's not recyclable, why it's not going through a MRF, why there's no markets, and what to do about that. The other recommendation we have is for the packaging sector, and we know this is already happening. It's the simplification of laminate structures so that your flexible packaging coming through the system is chemical recycling ready for when chemical recycling comes to the country. So in Europe, there's chemical recycling already in place. There's packaging being made from it, which eliminates any food grade issues or of contamination. So, and we know the CFlex consortium out of Europe has recently released quality standards or design standards on laminates. So that will help drive that. If you then go to the collection losses, now this is where the greatest losses are occurring in the supply chain, in the circular economy. So there's really 6 actions there we believe are key. First one, it's pretty obvious, introduce the CDS in all states, which is going to clean up glass supply and clean up plastics to get more circularity on both those materials and on aluminium. The other one, which having worked in the waste sector, this can be good and bad, increasing public place recycling bins. Now, having worked for a collector, I know they can become highly contaminated, but what I've seen around the country is a lot of councils where the aperture for the recycling bin essentially only takes beverage containers, which means the contamination is minimized and you can recycle them, because it's really the out of home use of beverages that's dropping that down quite dramatically. You'll notice here I've got also introduced a national curbside standard, and for those who are saying you're thinking I'm dyslexic because my numbers don't flow, I'll come back to this in a minute why I've got the numbers there. But essentially, to design packaging to a national standard is a huge step forward for packaging companies, because then you can design it with confidence that you know it's going to be collected in all 537 councils. So we're really keen to see that developed and happy to work with the whole supply chain on that. Once that's done, you're going to get harmonized education campaigns that motivate the general public. Now, there's 2 other trials or activities that are underway from the grocery sector. One is Nestle and IQ Renew have a trial of soft plastics being collected in the Central Coast. Now, we know that's been done in some other places in the past, and there was no market for the material, and therefore why collect it if you can't process it? The aim of this is to get proof of concept that plastic bags, bag within a bag, can be collected without any detriment to a MRF or a collection vehicle. And then the long-term aim is to use that for feedstock for chemical recycling and other uses, because about 25 to 30% of all plastics is soft plastic. So we do need to move on that. And one of the downsides, if you move from soft plastics to a rigid plastics, is you're actually going to use more plastics. And obviously the other one is adopt the Australasian recycling logo. So this is where it gets a little bit more complex. So if you go around the supply chain on plastics, there's no news to anyone probably on this call that in the past plastics came around, and in the main, with the exception of some local processing, most plastics have been sent off to Asia for sorting and processing from mixed bales. Now that that's closed with the National China Sword Policy, really there's a new customer, and really the new customer is Chemistry Australia's members. So they're the resin companies, LyondellBasell, BASF, Dow, Qenos, and so on. So if you think back to pre-2018, when China essentially shut the doors due to contamination issues, probably doesn't take a rocket scientist to think through that the resin companies are going to have very high quality standards. So what now has to happen is the quality coming through the supply chain has to meet their standards. And this is where I quote Stephen Covey, you've really got to begin with the end in mind. If you want to create the market, you've got to get the quality to come through the supply chain. So we believe the first step is creating resin standards. So quality standards for the resin producers, for them to accept the material, because without them, there won't be a local market. Therefore, you also need to create MRF outbound standards, because obviously most people know the secondary processors who have to take the sorted plastic, they have to convert it to a high quality standard for the resin producers. It only stands to reason that if they're going to build plant and equipment, it's fair that they know what their feedstock standard is and what their outbound standard needs to be. That will then make sure that the Recycling Modernisation Fund that the government is investing, so about $600 million, is spent wisely and on outcomes that we need. So from there, we're asking our members and sort of urging them to complete the APCO Plastic Demand Pledge to give confidence to those building or investing in infrastructure that there is demand for the material. And I know, talking to our members, there's a lot of demand. There's more demand than there is supply at the moment. So we're trying to quantify that. we also believe there's a need for an energy from waste policy framework to make sure that, again, for people investing in infrastructure, they've got surety of their feedstock of plastic. So it's not going to get gobbled up by energy from waste in the future, although that energy from waste has got a definite role in the country. Then you can move into infrastructure expansion in the waste sector, packaging plant and equipment, investment in the food and grocery sector, with confidence that you're spending money wisely. And the final thing that's required is a traceability system of plastics, because under competition law, and if you make an on-pack claim that something has recycled content, you need to be able to trace it through the supply chain. And anyone handling material at the moment under the new Modern Slavery Act needs to also report that any risk of modern slavery. So if there's no traceability, there's no demand. So really all that boils down to, and it's about my last slide, if you're a brand owner, these are the 6 things you focus on. So that's what we're directing our members to do, which is summarised on this page by really reviewing products through PrEP, applying the ARL, supporting voluntary product stewardship schemes like REDcycle, supporting APCO with the Recycle Content Pledge, and contacting packaging companies to request increased recycled content on their plastic to get the demand, and also request less complex harmonised packaging. And always bear in mind the life cycle impact of packaging, impact on food and chemical safety, and on food waste. So really that's where I was going to end. So happy to have any questions on that, but that's our view of the world, and really believe a packaging circular economy can happen.
Oh, thank you so much, Barry. That was very informative, and I actually really enjoy that you've taken some dense piece of work by APCO and turned it into a bunch of diagrams that we can all digest. For those of us who are design thinkers and visual thinkers, that's incredibly helpful. So our second speaker today is Blake Lindley, who is a director at the Australian Circular Textiles Association. He combines a formal education in economics and science with experience in regenerative design, which is hard to say, storytelling and carbon reduction. He's worked on driving practical sustainability action for associations and companies in consumer products, textiles, events, and property sectors. And today he's talking about finding a better fit, building back better through the circular economy. Over to you, Blake.
Thanks, Corinne. Just sharing my screen here now. I think you and I must have both been feeling nostalgic when we got prepared for today, because I started here. A much loved campaign, I think, going back some time now in our memory, but the slogan was "Do the right thing." And when we talk about recycling, when we talk about circular economy, I think that's changed. It's gone from what was a very easy and well understood concept, do the right thing, to something infinitely more complicated. Over time, we've sort of added on all these bits and pieces throughout the supply chain, and building complexity. We've added emissions, we've added trade policies, we've incorporated business and bin design, we've incorporated education, we've seen ethical sourcing, modern slavery, social responsibility, and the list goes on. And very soon we've grown what was once do the right thing, don't litter, throw things in the recycling bin when you can, into a almost infinitely complex recycling tree. When we actually look up, we see that that tree is surrounded by a whole lot of other trees. We see that the recycling tree is actually very closely related to the design tree. The design tree is infinitely associated with the emissions tree, and emissions itself is then related to sourcing. Sourcing is related to marketing, and very soon, this year's major impact, the global COVID-19 pandemic, has actually been a bit of a break to appreciate some of the simpler things all around us. But I wanted to come back to that analogy of the forest and sum that up to say that a system is not the sum of its parts, but it's the product of its interactions. We need to be able to see each of those trees. We need to be able to see each of the systems in the circular economy, each of the parts rather of the circular economy so that we can see the system as a whole and understand how it can work. We need to understand how the design system and the design element and the design machine can create demand for new product and demand for recycled content or recycled product. And we need to understand how one change in one place significantly affects the entire function of the system. So on to textiles, as Trinh mentioned. Textiles are everywhere. It's something that we are in Australia right now, starting from a very early stage on. There are some old hands for sure. The charity sector, as you well know, do an amazing job already reusing a lot of textiles across the country. And it's quite remarkable in that sense. We're far better placed and far more proficient at reusing textiles than we are recycling. In a way, the textiles industry is one step ahead, despite us recycling less than 1% of textiles across the country. We have a well-informed, well-intentioned consumer group, particularly with regard to clothing, but we see the opportunity lying across a huge breadth of products. I've thrown a few up there. You can see carpets, you can see furniture, bedding, mattresses. There's all kinds of things, netting products in agriculture. The list is almost endless where they end up, and we don't fully account for those in our auditing and disposal-based reporting. The impact goes far beyond that. It doesn't always show up as the largest component of landfill, but it is one of those products like food, and it is classified as organic waste in New South Wales, that has a disproportionately high carbon impact. Estimates are as high as 8% of the world's CO2 emissions are generated by the textile industry. We know there is a huge dependence on imported clothing in Australia. And we know that a huge portion of it comes from actually the clothing manufacturer, not necessarily the end of life, but the manufacturer of them. And also garment care tends to be around 20 to 30%, and is really easy and immediate place for us to start. So on to ACTA and our vision. I mean, the association, we are a young association, having started last year and been quite rattled by the global pandemic in terms of memberships and what that has meant for particularly clothing brands in this space. We've pivoted to deliver far more, I suppose, focus on the governance portion of our remit this year, which has been really set us up to do a lot of proactive work in the future. And I'll touch on that in a second. But our purpose there is reversing the growth in textiles consumption. Leveling that off is the plan. You know, we mentioned on the previous slide that a lot of the impact of textiles comes in production. Reversing consumption is a critical part of minimizing that component. 95% resource recovery is what we'd love to see for Australia, and movement towards a national product stewardship scheme on a national level. Our primary function is research and advocacy, informing decision-making with high-quality data, incentivizing and also shoring up investment, which I think speaks to some of the points Barry made very clearly just prior. And building capacity, so exploring and expanding existing channels of recovery, particularly reuse, where textiles is really leading the economy, whilst we work on scaling effective recycling solutions to pick up what it cannot handle. Critically, ACTA addresses an information asymmetry. There is a huge amount of work being done in small corners all over the place on textile recovery, tiny little projects here and there, that need to be aggregated and centralized into one knowledge body in order to accelerate progress. To summarize, we working with government, all levels of government now, advocating for product stewardship, for tracking and monitoring of imports and environmental product mandates. With the state level, as I mentioned, we're currently undertaking, and I was really hoping to present today, but like all good projects, all projects done well, it is running a little over time now. But we have undertaken the largest textile waste data study in the country, which is really where this all starts. We are then following that up with a review of an update of textile tracking metrics. So we continue to monitor both change, progress, and measure success, as well as adapt to new challenges in the future. Relating textile action to emissions reduction, which is a critical component in the context of every state now having a net zero target. and then addressing infrastructure needs and assessments on a both a strategic and local level for recycling. Locally, there's a big push to deliver better waste services and more coverage, particularly with textiles. We think that, and some of the work we're doing now is repicturing textiles as more, rather than 4.6% you might often see of the curbside services, to more like 6 to 8%, which actually makes it the third largest or fourth largest component of the curbside waste bins. Educating consumers and supporting their opportunity to reuse by charities and otherwise, and grassroots action to better understand the impact that consumption has. For industry, we're working on through the network function on how and where we can recycle textiles, how we can aggregate knowledge and what can and cannot be recycled, better understanding and describing how we design for end of life and educate for extended use, which is a major component sometimes overlooked in the circular economy, is actually lifetime extension. Creating the forums for change, which speaks to that network model, or the trees earlier. We are the product of the interactions, and we need to create that space where the likes of, you know, a product designer at an H&M can go and speak with you know, a person operating a charity store, or someone who's operating a recycling center, for example. Understanding both ends of the story helps us all function better in the context of a system. Coordinating investment, R&D and activity to provide critical local alignment as well. And then obviously provide the important international link with some of the European countries and others who are some way ahead of us in this. I will wrap up here before leaving you with some links to sort of further reading on behalf of ACTA and what we do. I've only got 10 minutes here today, so it's been quick. This is one of my favorite wartime quotes, and I think it stands or holds true, particularly this year in the light of everything that we've seen. Anyone who isn't confused really doesn't understand the situation. I suppose, you know, if you are feeling confused, if you are feeling overwhelmed, all I can say, you know, to Corinne's point when she opened this session, is that that's entirely natural. We need to be able to see that. We need to be able to sit and look at that complexity and feel a little bit overwhelmed to know that we're actually seeing the full picture. If you're not, you know, when there are sort of the resolute mindset, it can be reductionist in its solutions. So there's a time today and these learning forums moving forward to develop that empathy, to understand how we can all accept and see different viewpoints of people and actors throughout the supply chain, so that we can actually design better solutions and new solutions moving forward. We need to overcome the paralysis that can sometimes leave us. And that is really just a matter of remembering that the actions we take today really are designing what happens tomorrow. So I'll leave you here. There's two very easy, very accessible pieces of work that we've done already, published and online, a common thread, and also our position paper from this year. They outline 2030 strategy in more detail, and also everything you really need to know about the textile waste challenge and opportunity in Australia via our position paper there. Really looking forward to answering some questions and fielding all of your queries on this interesting area in question time. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Blake. And I know that's some really good pieces of work that ACTA have put out there for anyone who's deeply interested in textiles and the sorts of issues and challenges you guys are facing. So thanks for that overview. And I loved the graphical diagram rolled out into those trees. It was a great idea. So I might borrow that off you in future. Finally, I'd like to welcome Mark Smith to the stage. Mark is the Chief Executive Officer of the Waste Recycling Industry Association of Queensland. And if you've read his bio, I think my chief takeaway was that Mark really enjoys a good industry disruption challenge. He used to work in Victoria's peak body for waste and recycling at a time of unprecedented disruption. He was impacted by contracting export markets, as in smaller export markets, toxic industrial fires, illegal waste activities, failures of regulatory control, collapsing local markets, the biggest overhaul of environmental regulation in the state's history. And then just for fun, he took up the helm of WRIQ just as the COVID pandemic started to transform how we live and work. So I think that you seem to enjoy disruption quite a bit, Mark, and I think what you're talking to us about today will probably continue that theme. He's going to talk about reaching out for our shared future potential.
Thank you, and thanks Waste Expo for having me. My other panelists are aware of this because we did have a little debrief before I started. So I'll just put the warning out there. I have actually had the hiccups since yesterday afternoon, and I'm hoping they don't start up again while I'm giving this presentation. As highlighted, I am going to be talking about our shared future potential with a particular focus on engaging other industries. My focus will be around the education and tertiary sector. A little bit about RIQ and the organisation that I work for. So RIQ represents Queensland's waste and resource recovery sector. We do a lot more than just collecting bins. Up on the screen now is actually a data set that we collected about 18 months ago, I believe it was, looking at the economic contribution that the sector makes. But I do want to highlight that the waste and resource recovery sector isn't just about employing people. It's also making hundreds of millions of dollars worth of investment into state economies around the country, investing in people, which is often something that we don't talk enough about when talking about the waste and resource recovery sector, as well as investing in communities, investing in equipment, and creating new jobs every time a new piece of infrastructure needs to be built, or as the industry is starting to tap into Industry 4.0, a whole heap of new jobs that didn't exist previously are being created. Now, the reason why our sector exists, and hopefully this won't be too new for people that are participating today, is primarily to support every other aspect of the economy. A lot of the time, I think there isn't enough focus or attention given to the fact that the waste and recycling sector is delivering services to every other part of the economy. So next time we're having conversations with family or friends or people outside the industry, I think it might be really important just to remind them that actually they're all part of the waste and recycling system. They have a really key and important part to play to make sure that the system's working effectively. An example is putting things in the right bins. What I just wanted to touch on is this idea that what the sector's doing and what we need to be doing is far more than just building recycling sites, even though investment into the industry is really important. CSIRO a few years ago worked with me while I was still at Sustainability Victoria to look at understanding some of the key drivers and factors that build community acceptance and trust. Now, the reason why it's important that we invest in this kind of stuff is because it's important that the community trust the systems that are being offered to them, the services that are being offered to them through their curbside. We know that if community understand and can see the benefits an industry sector is providing the broader community or broader society, they're more trusting of that service and they're more accepting of that service. This sundial just represents some of those factors and how they feed into acceptance. Now, some of these things sit within the realm of government, such as governance, while other items, while other items such as quality for relationships and trust in the sector sit with site operators and potentially with local government. The areas that we need to start focusing a little bit more on are on the right side of this dial, which include minimising impacts to wellbeing, increasing the benefits to wellbeing, supporting and increasing people's understanding about the waste and resource recovery system, including starting to work a bit more on the behaviours involved in recycling correctly and reducing waste generation. RIQ is engaged in a few programs to kind of support the objectives of social licence to operate. And I'm just having some trouble moving my slides forward. Karen, maybe we could just take a few answers because I think I need to restart my device.
All right, we can totally do that. Thanks for the heads up, Mark.
Okay.
I'm just having a look at the questions I've got written here. Do you know what? I think, Blake, if you and Barry want to come back on for a second, I think it's an issue that might talk to both of you. Thank you. So I feel like it was Barry's presentation mentioned this, but Blake, it really does impact on the textiles industry as well. So I might cover this one off and then we can come back for some of the other questions. But Barry, you talked about modern slavery overlaps and supply chains needing to be tracked. And I know that that's hitting the textile space. I'm just interested with the focus on modern slavery being so key to corporates and supply chains at the moment, how that might roll into circular economy outcomes and drive the sort of change in engagement we're after.
It's a pretty key one, because if anyone is unaware, so at the beginning of this year, the Department of Home Affairs really kicked off or implemented the Modern Slavery Act. So anyone with a business, I forget the turnover, over $100 million has to submit a modern slavery report. And you have to be aware of any risk of slavery in your supply chain. It's not acts of slavery, it's any risk where it could be. So with Recycleit going offshore, as it has in the past, if it's not traceable, no one can buy it. They won't buy it because they don't know where it's been. So you have to know, and we've all seen the terrible images, and I'm not saying that's the standard, but there's images of young kids sitting in piles of plastics and all sorts. So until there's traceability, no one will buy the material. So that one's really key for us. It's a deal breaker. And the other aspect of that is just food safety. And for the packaging companies, for the supply chain, is to make sure you can decontaminate it. Because you need to know that you're not taking, of a case I've heard, a blood bag and converting it into a packaging and putting cordial in it. You need to make sure you know the source of the packaging, where it's been and how it's been managed.
Cool. Blake, have you got commentary on supply chain tracking for textiles or impact of modern slavery on the sorts of conversations your members are having?
Yeah, it's been something that's been around in the fashion industry. You think back to Nike, probably 20, even 30 years ago or more, they're being exposed on sweatshop labor, they called it, back in the headlines. So it's certainly been something that's been around in the fashion industry for a long time and tarred its image, I suppose. It presents, the Modern Slavery Act is obviously triggering further insight and introspection at those organizations on how they are managing this. I think that goes without question. And it is being proactively managed. I would argue better than some industries, I think, because they've had the attention on them for so long. We're in the situation right now where there is a lot of clothing moving internationally. So there's huge markets. There is not one of the questions I was just tapping away in answer to in the Q&A was on where's clothing recycling happening. And the short answer is it's in this, less than 5%. If you want to discount energy from energy recovery, it's globally less than 5%. What we would call, or what you might see reported as recycling sometimes, is typically reuse, which is packing in a container, sending it offshore, sending it to a foreign country, which is reuse element, but also has its limits. So I think we need to be very aware of them, and also for exactly the same reasons Barry's outlined, tracking and managing those processes with greater clarity.
Fabulous. Thank you both. So I'm aware, Barry, I'm aware that Mark has restarted and is ready to roll. Yeah. So right. I think after tracking supply chains being an important part of circular economy, we might pass back over to Mark. So if you want to just shut down your screens and mute yourselves again, thank you.
Apologies about that. Thanks for bearing with me. The sundial, some of these activities clearly sit within the realm of government, such as governance, regulation, compliance. Some of these aspects sit across multiple stakeholders like local council and industry. And then there's some items here which I think government, local government and industry have a shared responsibility in, and RIQ's currently engaged in some activities to really look at broadening some of those benefits that we're bringing into communities, and also expanding people's understanding and knowledge of the sector. Two of these new programs, which RIQ will be launching shortly, relate to our Future Leader program. I'll put up an advertisement for that towards the end of this slide deck, which is really about upskilling young leaders about the future workforce, of which we're saying circular economy is a really key fundamental thing. One of the key features of this program is that we're not just wanting to target people within the industry. We have a habit of talking amongst ourselves, and it is about involving other industries into these conversations around what does circular economy mean for cafes or restaurants, or what does it mean for offices and people outside of the waste and resource recovery sector. Something else that I'm really excited to be working on at the moment is a national internship program, which is all about providing access to junior talent across Australia's university sector into placement opportunities within the waste and resource recovery sector, which is all about, once again, broadening that conversation around circular economy and who's part of that conversation, including some of the new ideas and the new ways of thinking that any industry that's in a state of transition needs to look at embracing. What we've got some interns working on at the moment, which I just wanted to let this group know about, is an investigation looking into the $5.4 billion collected across state jurisdictions through the landfill levy. I'll put a caveat on that. That is over the last 5 years. What we've seen in recent years is state governments across the country, and now even the federal government, issuing huge amounts of money through government grant programs, grants to build infrastructure, grants to tackle food waste, grants to tackle litter and recycling. And what we're using interns for, including some data analysts and economists, is investigating one, how effective some of these grant programs are, looking at what materials and what types of activities are being funded and what aren't. We heard a little bit earlier from Blake about some of the challenges with textiles. What we'll probably find is materials, there are certain material streams, and I'd probably argue textiles is one of them, that may not receive the right attention through government intervention. We'll also be releasing a survey shortly, which will be going out to local government, private sector, and community groups, wanting to get feedback from people around what they think about government grant processes. Are they an easy thing to be involved in? Do you think they're run well? What improvements or ideas do you have to make the process better? Or what ideas do you have around making government intervention in this space better? Because we want to take those ideas forward and present them back to government in a consistent way. We've also been using interns to help us with some of our social media activities and online presence. And what we've utilised some comms and marketing interns for is expanding our presence on social media. And through the support of these interns, we've actually been able to double our footprint on social media. And I'd encourage you, if you aren't already, to look at following RIQ on Twitter and on LinkedIn. These interns have got great ideas and far, as someone who's slowly not able to keep up with what's happening on social media, it's great having some young people around to, tell me what Insta is actually for and how it can be used. And finally, I'll just have up as my last slide. We've started some promotion about our Future Leader program. I'd encourage anyone who's interested in the program to please register your interest via member services at riq.com.au. The Future Leader program will kick off next year, and there'll be some more announcements about this program next week during National Recycling Week, inviting young people across a range of different industry sectors to take part. Thanks, that's all I had. Fantastic, thank you, Mark. And also I'd like to congratulate you on not getting the hiccups again. You've managed to deal with that in the 2 times you've done a presentation. For everyone listening along at home, Mark chaired this morning's session on circular economy and seems to have avoided the hiccups in both times, so that's awesome. If all of our panelists would like to turn their cameras back on, please, and unmute, I'm going to pepper you all with some of the most interesting questions. We have a total of 39 questions that have been submitted during this presentation, and I know that 20 of them seem to have been answered as we've gone along, so thanks to all of our panelists for typing away merrily in the background to ensure that we could give the best value to our audience as possible. But I thought we'd start with something that Melanie asked, a really interesting question. I'm going to tie it into something else that Trevor Evans said this morning in his presentation. So he announced that the product stewardship scheme is being broadened from a products to a materials focused, or at least allowing for a materials focused where it hasn't in the past. And I wanted to understand how this might impact on the areas you work in, and how does it change the sorts of parties you might collaborate with. And Melanie's question touches on the same one, so I'll just give you her
her question as well, which is that we seem to be breaking circular economy into different resource types, but demand creation will require action across multiple resource types and waste types. So how do we meet that challenge, and how do we innovate in that space? So I might throw over to Blake in the first instance. You got any thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. It's something it's something we've grappled with. I mean, there was obviously a big round of product stewardship grants at the start of this year, and as ACTA, I actually just wrote a little response to that in the question, because it was a good question. Our experience is that, we have people like the mattress recyclers coming to us and saying, hey, we've got, we thought we had a whole bunch of polyester, but in the end, it's not really enough to get, the guys who might be able to do something polyester out of bed to come speak with us. And they said, where else can we get it? Who else has polyester? And I said, great, actually, banners and flags is a huge source as well. And we see it showing up in shade cloth and scrim and events and all kinds of other places. So what we needed to do, I think it speaks to that point, which is, to steward and understand that these products exist, these materials exist not just in single products, they're spread everywhere. And by centralizing that knowledge, by centralizing stakeholders, throughout almost all of the myriad parts of the economy, we're actually aggregating that data, pulling it together and creating the opportunities for sort of closed loops within a material. So yeah, I fully support that. I think it's a great move. Yeah.
Barry, any thoughts on packaging? I know you've had a product stewardship scheme in the space for a very long time now, but what would a materials focus do rather than a products focus?
I agree with Blake. It provides scale. If you look at products, like if you look at probably the last one was microbeads, voluntary push to remove microbeads, managed by Acor, and I think 98% phase out really quickly. That was on one material. So if you go to plastics, a lot of people group plastics as a material when they're not. There's 7 different materials, and then you have all the combinations between them. So when you look at things like PET and HDPE with reasonable recycling rates, pretty good infrastructure that can be expanded. They're not great, but they're a long way ahead of others. So things like flexibles, LDPE, means you look at those in a whole different light. You need the infrastructure, you need the demand. So I probably spend more of my time talking to the likes of Amcor and LyondellBasell and chemical recyclers like Licella about what is the solution long term? How do we do this? Because we're packaging agnostic. We don't care what type of packaging people use, but it's very hard to beat the food waste and food safety benefits of plastic. You will increase food waste if you don't have plastic, and that's a huge environmental issue. So,
Thank you. Mark, any thoughts in the space?
No, I just agree with what's been said. I do think that when we are able to prioritize materials, and I think if you look at American agriculture and kind of look at what's happened with corn, rightly or wrongly, you kind of see all of these new products and all of these new things kind of created out of a material type or out of a particular product type, because there's been such a focus on it. So there is heaps of opportunity, and kind of, I'd argue, history tells us that there's a lot of opportunity. So.
Cool, thank you. All right, so moving on.
Can I pipe up, Corinne, just for the sake of making an interesting discussion? I suppose I was very much pro material stewardship a moment ago, but I mean, I'm interested, from yourself and the others in the room, like, stewardship requires a pretty tightly knit and well-aligned group of stakeholders to be effective. By casting that too wide, how do you avoid doing so? How do you avoid making that, diluting it to such an extent where you're never going to be able to coordinate, 500 companies versus 10? Interesting question. I don't know.
Mark, thoughts? Yeah, being a CEO of a couple of waste and recycling industry groups in the past.
Yeah, so I think I think sometimes where we fall down with a lot of this stuff is maybe looking at some of the, and this isn't a criticism of the people in the departments or agencies, but, like sometimes, and I think about the circular economy policies that have been produced in some parts of the country, they kind of sit in an environmental kind of realm and an environmental kind of mindset when we're talking about the need to changes across the economy. I don't know. I think it's an important question to ask. I don't know how effective some of the approaches have been or will be without the right people sitting at the table. Think of, in any ecosystem, you've got those keystone species that kind of, disproportionately impact the ecosystem. Are those people sitting at the table when we talk about these kinds of programs? Because if they're not, then
yeah, it won't work. Actually, that's a really excellent segue to the question I was just about to ask, which is often we talk about this will not work without the supply side of the equation and the demand pull through. If we want to create a circle, the circle's got to keep flowing at some level, acknowledging stocks and flows as a central concept in circular economy. And I'm wondering what's stopping us setting it up, or are you seeing enough demand coming through? And actually, from a segue from that, I'm noticing, Mark, that in Victoria, I was very impressed with their Recycle Victoria policy that required recycled content in infrastructure projects finally getting the procurement people to drive that part of the conversation as opposed to the environmental people driving that part of the conversation. So I guess my question is, are you seeing enough interest in the market? And a question from the chat came through of what infrastructure incentives are available or needed to ensure stuff can be returned and continue to cycle through this process.
Yeah, well, I think state government is one of those keystone species if we're talking about the buying power that state government has. And it is great to see some of those commitments by governments across the country, because local governments are also doing some really great stuff. Personal experience, or what I've kind of seen happen throughout the last few years, has been, irrespective of the great government policies that are in place, there's a cultural change that needs to happen at the officer level and at some of these key decision maker levels. So what kinds of programs are in place to support that kind of key decision maker group? Because it's not just about having the media release saying we're going to do this. There needs to be a big kind of cultural change among key decision makers below the ministers and below the CEOs that need to happen as well.
Fabulous. Barry, have you got any comments on sort of pull through and demand and changing nature of your industry?
Very timely. I've been having discussions about this all week, and there's a few packaging companies that we're talking to about it, because when we talk to our members, they say, we've got the demand, we need the supply. And I know from the other side, they're saying we need the demand before we can underpin investment, which is why I guess we've created that circular economy roadmap, so everyone knows who's doing what when. And there's a critical time frame coming up with the Recycling Modernisation Fund, because there has to be expansion in plastics. If I talk specifically plastics, on PET and HDPE and so on. So we're urging our members to go talk to their suppliers. Things like chemical recycling for LDPE, that's greenfield, it needs big investment. You need to get aggregate demand. Aggregating demand as an association is illegal. It's another word for it would be a collusion or a cartel. So you have to go through the proper channels with the ACCC and so on. So, but knowing the timing and getting the right people together through the ACCC process is something that also has to happen. Otherwise, there's a high risk you'll end up in jail. So that's not something I want to do. So all those sort of discussions are occurring at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Blake, any comments on sort of pull through circularity and what needs to be in place for people to get textiles back to make sure they can go back into that supply chain?
Same problem, different industry, I suppose. I think that was well covered by those guys. So
yeah, no problem.
Yeah, well, actually, just to say that synthetics offer a really good opportunity for sure. So synthetic textiles currently, there's not a lot of difference between the polyester you find there and probably a lot of the stuff Barry's dealing with. So particularly when we start thinking about geotechnical fabrics, so ground sheeting fabric, hoarding and weed mat, they got a great name for it, which is totally eluding me right now. But those types of things there, potentially, that's intersector, material flow and circularity opportunities. Natural fibers from our side need to, behave in the biological way, where they decompose, as cellulose structures over time, and sometimes don't have the same longevity. But Anyway, yeah, another big prickly issue.
Yeah, that's wicked problems is I think our joy in this industry and this space, how to take something that looks very simple on the outside to a consumer, and then you sort of unpack all of the layers and understand the complexities, and we will, I'm sure, continue to try and solve this problem for the rest of our careers. My question is, again, you've all spoken obliquely about the need to work outside of your traditional silos, notwithstanding we're talking about particular products and materials, and to approach this problem perhaps differently to how the waste industry has traditionally approached the collection and putting of stuff into a hole in the ground. If someone was looking to get started in this space and to sort of understand and do something practical, what would be your top tip of how to work with other people or just get started in the space? And Mark, actually with your Young Leaders program, I might sort of throw to you first.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, government can sometimes be a really powerful force in terms of change, but it can also be really difficult, especially at the moment, trying to get buy-in and support for projects and activities with government. And what I'd probably recommend people do is identify or demonstrate success in what they're doing without trying to approach state governments for support or funding, because a lot of the times the way that funding is set up or grant programs are set up for this, it can make it really difficult because you need to have a project ready to go when the grants are announced. So we always kind of look at encouraging people to just get started on things. They don't necessarily need government to kick off, but just like any business venture, there's going to be risks, but there's potentially also going to be wins if you're successful and you identify a niche kind of service that no one else is offering, but also build on what's working.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Barry or Blake, we'd like to go next on this one.
Yeah, I can jump in if you want. It's a really interesting question because having worked in both the grocery sector and the waste sector, there's a real fundamental difference having worked in both. So when you launch a product in the grocery sector, you have to make it, you have to manufacture it, you have to invest it, you have to build the stock, and you don't know whether it's going to be ranged in a supermarket, and you don't know whether it's going to be ranged for 6 weeks, 12 weeks, a year, 10 years. So there's an element of risk in all the transactions, and how you manage that is talk to your customers, know your consumer, know your customer, have joint plans. That de-risks it. And having worked in the waste sector, it's been based on tenders, so it's de-risked. You win a tender, it's de-risked. It's a bit of a new world now because you have to meet the quality standards of a different customer. So, and I'm talking plastics. So, talk to the new market, understand their needs, and adapt your business to those needs. And then you can find a way forward. So to me, it's all about customer focus and understanding their needs and moving with them.
Cool. Blake?
Yeah, I mean, I just add to that, you know, in that circular startup space, there's some really good work. It's a question that was, or it's actually a space that's been dominated for a long time by the, you know, Fuji's, Xeroxes of the world, you know, to go back to your intro, Corinne. But, you know, like, what are we doing are we going to be solving the same problem in 30 years time? You know, we're still going to be transitioning companies in 30 years time to a circular model, because there's a whole myriad of startups happening today in that traditional mold, you know, who don't have access to the information they need. So I think it's a really good question. There is, to flip that on its head, opportunity everywhere, right? Because every product you can see basically needs a circular redesign. Where government sits in that is actually to create the environment where those new businesses and new business models can flourish, because we need to see firm and, you know, I guess well-visioned government in this space that is, you know, moving towards having linear models internalize their costs of doing business, which they traditionally push elsewhere, because the circular economy really, and that model is asking businesses to internalize that as their means of business.
To note with these kinds of conversations is that we often talk and want to celebrate innovation, but then when businesses start to do things that start disrupting the market, there's obviously a number of stakeholders kind of are resistant to that change. You know, we saw things where, whether it was Uber or Airbnb, where government suddenly like, no, we want to stop this, we want to tax it differently, we want to do this, we want to do that, trying to curb that innovation. And those kinds of things really do need to also be appreciated in this space, is that if you're going to come in and disrupt a market a lot, or even in a small local region, making sure that you identify who's potentially going to lose from this kind of disruption and see how you can effectively work with them, especially if it is a transitioning kind of phase. I'd probably argue that a lot of government support lately has not really looked at transitioning parts of the sector that need to either phase out or upgrade. Instead, we've kind of gone for this new thing of building new facilities or building, world-class kind of facilities. And there's this kind of older stock that's kind of left behind, where 5 years ago that was probably considered whiz-bang as well. So it's just something to contextualize the conversation.
This actually, okay, so I was saving this question for last, but I think it has actually worked in quite well. There was a question that came through in the chat, which touches on, I think, something that Blake just said, and Mark, is like, do you all want to speculate on how many years it is going to take to make substantial change? Now, Blake, you just referenced we've got businesses starting now that lock things in. I know I do work with the commercial building space, and they're building buildings right now and looking in leases right now that will take them out to the next sort of 10, 20 years. And if they don't get this stuff right at the moment, and building life is 50 years from now, what are we doing? And then Mark, your sort of statement of we're playing in that early space and not changing out the people that are already there to help them upgrade and change. So how many years before we get substantial change? This she might round us out with a beautiful thought on, maybe it's only 6 months. It'll be great.
I'm going to say it's going to be approximately 5 to 10 years. And the reason being, we're already starting to see financial institutions push down these requirements around who they're funding, what they're going to fund, what insurance companies are going to fund, what insurance companies aren't going to fund. And this all relates to some of the stuff that we talk about in the Future Leader program as well, is that the idea of triple bottom line reporting is going to be evolving over the next few years, and what businesses are doing to bring local benefits to their communities and how they then get funded for that, I think will start to trigger or in some ways kind of speed up this process. And if you see large operators like Coca-Cola, which is a keystone kind of species, moving around, implementing systems and processes to become circular, it won't be long before others follow. How that permeates down to the average person, I don't know, but big companies I think will get on board in 5 to 10.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I tend to agree. The exact same as Mark, because there's some materials, and this is where I like the government's move to materials. There are some materials that are highly circular now. There was one of the questions about, is 49% really gold standard on circularity of paper? Well, no, we've got to improve it. But I was talking to a big company yesterday. They're at 99.9% on all of their packaging with recycled content. It's 99.9, except for their plastics, and that drags them down. So where you can do it, companies are already doing it and they're chasing it. But there's going to be some materials that are a bit harder, and also we're also working with another association to look at the smaller businesses who don't have the resources, don't have the awareness of how do we get the message to them. There may need to be some government funding to help them with packaging transitions so they can move there, taking the lead from the big companies. Probably the other point on that is just worth mentioning. This company I spoke to yesterday, each time they trial a new packaging type, it's a 6-month process, because they've got to trial the manufacturing run, they've got to trial the shelf life, they've got to do expedited shelf life testing, because they've got to have 2 years to sell it into the retailers, so they've got to expedite that. Quickest they can do that is 6 months. They've got to do transport testing. And to do that, you've got to run it on a production line. And for this company to shut down their production line to get an hour of production trials is $10,000. For each plate of manufacturing to change their labelling is $5,000. So they do it sequentially. So that's the sort of thing that's happening behind the scenes. So that's going to take a little bit of time, which is, I guess, why the labelling is taking a little while coming through. Mm-hmm. And that does slow things down, but you get a better outcome.
Blake, circular textiles, how long?
I think, 2030, actually,
yeah, based on your strategy.
Yeah. No, look, what comes to mind, I mean, is like the models, there's definitely, it's a well-researched field, is how information spreads. And I think what we see right now is that, you're always going to have an early adopter, an innovator, and then you've got a majority following type model. And what Barry's described there, we've got companies who are setting standards and pushing that progressively right now. One of the other questions, which I'll just link it to, was, involvement in things like the Australian Circular Economy Hub at Planet Ark. I think, there will be increasingly forums to accelerate the spread of this knowledge to those businesses that need it, and overcome the information asymmetry I mentioned. Like, there's so much well-intentioned but somewhat under-informed action, particularly on behalf of new brands. I think that's fair to say. Barry would see it all the time. Want to package as best I can? Do I use bioplastic or not? What's the answer? And I can't fund a $20,000 study to a consultant to let me know why. So I think all of the building blocks are there, and hopefully we're really on that upward trajectory as far as tangible, real action goes.
Brilliant. All right, well, that gets us very close to time. So rather than asking another complicated question, I might thank the three of you for giving your time and to all of the excellent questions we had. There were a number of questions around organics, reprocessing and organic circular economy, and what we can and can't do with organics and food waste and fruit waste. And I did sort of avoid them, so apologies if that was your question. And I did that simply because, and I'm going to quote my managing director here, we can do composting. Food organic recovery in this country is a no-brainer, and we should just be doing it. So I thought that as a group of people, you'd all just do what you're currently doing, which is nodding your head going, let's just capture food, let's get it out of the general waste bins, let's get it back onto our land, let's regenerate our agriculture. So for those of you who are asking those questions, apologies for ignoring them. But on the other hand, the Waste Expo, I'm sure, had some really excellent sessions on organics waste. So I would direct you to those ones. And on the topic of the Waste Expo, the next session on the circular economy, so they've got 3 sessions on the circular economy. There were the 2 that we've had today, and then another one is called Educating the Public in Circular Economy, and it's on next Wednesday at the 11th of November. And there's certainly plenty of space if you want to register for that conversation. So thank you all for listening, and thanks again, the 3 of you, for participating, as I'm sure all of us are clapping in the background for your excellent insights and sharing your time with us today. So thank you very much.